next, we've got the Responsible Autonomous Vehicle Deployment Panel. And I think pretty much everybody that's come up here has pointed out the fact that what is needed for all this to happen is a lot of collaboration. Consumers, regulators, industry has to come together to create a pathway forward. So Christopher Hart in particular made that statement eloquently. This panel is going to go over how we can work together to make that happen. Social, economic, environmental benefits of autonomous vehicles are all there waiting to be had, and so it's a question of how we're going to do it. So I'm going to call each person up like I did before. The moderator is Steve Levine, editor of Future and Axios. Come on up. We have Christophe Sapé, the CEO of Navia, Faye Francie, Executive Director, Automotive Information Sharing and Analysis Center, Dr. Maya Blanco, Director, Center for Public Policy and Partnerships and Outreach, Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, Alex Epstein, Director, Transportation Safety, National Safety Council, Cito Ortiz, Commander, San Jose, California Highway Patrol. Sorry, I'm trying to push through this quickly because we're running a little late. Guys, have at it. Do we have enough chairs?
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me to be part of this really terrific event. And we have two big questions before us that the speakers and the panels until now have raised, and one of them is how do you safely deploy, and the other one is how do you address public perceptions of autonomous driving. So we have a super panel. So we're going to start. I want to start with Faye.
Okay.
All right. So let's try to get a big picture. The big picture, what does regulation, if we're talking regulation, what does that look like, whether that's something that's initiated by industry, by public policy groups, or by the government? And Christopher raised this issue of aviation. What does aviation tell us from your view?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a hard one. And I really want to recognize Chairman Hart. He did a fabulous job at really talking about the big vision as well as what aviation did. My background is in aviation. I actually spent most of my career in aviation working at the Boeing company. And we were part of that endeavor that Chairman Hart talked about. And it was a unique endeavor of bringing together all of the different elements and participants and stakeholders in the aviation ecosystem to actually work together and try to figure out how do we increase efficiencies of the current system that was somewhat limited. And that also required the FAA, and I believe Chairman Hart was at the FAA around that time period. Regulation is a necessary activity. Bar none. We have to have it. It's we as Joe Q public expect it, and we need it. This is not an easy area to regulate. When you start to look at where we are from vehicles and into regulation, it's very different than aviation. So let me give you an example. In aviation, the OEMs are regulated, and they have to do a certificate for the flying product or the airplane. Also, the airlines are regulated, and they have to operate that aircraft very specifically in a very controlled environment. In vehicles, we don't have that same regulatory aspect. Yes, we have DMV, and we have licenses we all have to go get, but there's not an overall operator that is regulated for the operation of the vehicle, whether it's autonomous or not. This is a clear differentiator, and as we look at going into smart cities and where we're really heading, which is very exciting with all of this autonomy, I believe that the dynamics will dynamically change, dramatically change, in how the regulators will have to address this issue for the autonomous vehicles.
Great. Thank you very much. I wanted to remind the technical crew if they can turn on the timer here so we don't stay up here for 2 hours, 3 hours, which we could. Cito, you're next. So of the panelists, you're the only one really who's dealing hands-on with the safety issue, and you've been doing it for 24 years.
That's right.
So can you just paint a picture, big picture? What does that look like? What are your concerns? And can you give when CHP is thinking about this? What are a couple of the ideas that you guys have?
Well, really, I want to thank Velodyne for including the Highway Patrol as part of this discussion, today's event. When it involves traffic safety, that involves the Highway Patrol. We're a traffic-oriented agency. So the Highway Patrol's outlook on autonomous vehicle, autonomous technology is very favorable. We're open, we're glad for it, we're excited for it, we embrace it. We need it for a number of reasons. We're going back for the last number of years at the inception of legislation here in California, the Highway Patrol, and I'm gonna beat that word to death, collaborative. We've been collaborating with a lot of state and federal agencies such as the DMV and California Transportation Agency Working Group and many others to shape policy when it comes to autonomous vehicle and when they enter the system. We have 34 million registered vehicles in this state. That's just registered vehicles. We have 500 plus autonomous vehicles out in California roadways right now. And something that Ann talked about a little bit, because the CHP works with AMVA very much. What's a concern to me, to answer your question, is that our mileage death rate here in California is on the increase. What is the mileage death rate? The mileage death rate is the number of persons killed in a vehicle collision per 100 million miles driven. So the last 7, 8 years, that number has been increasing. So that's important because more lives are being lost on the roadways. 35 to 40,000 across the country each year is a conservative number. So that's not good news. We think, the Highway Patrol thinks that there is a great possibility with this new technology coming out that's going to save lives. If lives are being saved, that's fantastic news, that's priceless. So we're really for it. We're working with the legislatures, and we'll continue to do that in the near future.
Great. Thanks, Cito. Alex, you're next. So Cito raised the statistic. For the last 2 years, more than 40,000 people died on U.S. roads. So is in terms of initiating safety measures, driverless cars, is there some number that's higher than zero that is an acceptable number? What determines what is safe?
Well, the easy answer to that hard question is go home and look at your daughter or your son and ask yourself, if they're the one, is that acceptable? Truly, the only acceptable answer is zero. And we work with the DOT and all the various branches of government to administer a program called Road to Zero. We strongly believe that automation is one important link in getting to zero. We also believe that doing what we do now, doubling down on what works, we call it. We're talking about speed mitigation. We're talking about impairment mitigation. We're talking about distraction. You know, automation in a car isn't always good. Sometimes the big displays that show up that are designed like iPads are not necessarily good because everything is visual. There used to be, when I was coming up, there used to be a haptic display in terms of push buttons and knobs. No more. So if you want confirmation of GPS or playlists or the review of that restaurant you're writing as you're driving and you're trying to push out to Yelp, and I'm not condoning that, by the way. I'm just saying that happens, and you can do it today. If you want to do that, you have to confirm it visually. I'd like to, first of all, thank Velodyne for bringing us all here together. The National Safety Council has been around for 100 years. We were behind the Click It or Ticket campaign, which introduced seatbelts and airbags to America. We currently run the largest ADAS education program in America. It's called My Car Does What? Because most people don't know what their car does. And so we're trying to teach people the building blocks of autonomy through ADAS. And to answer your question,
Zero.
Zero.
Zero is the answer. All right, thank you. Thank you, Alex. Myra, you're up next. So you work with all of the players. You're working with industry, with the government, public policy groups, and when we spoke before the panel today, you focused on the end user. Let's think about what does the end user want? What is the end user thinking of their expectations, their trust? Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think we are at a very important time. We're at a time that we need to start educating. We're doing a lot of geek talk, which I enjoy a lot, but words really matter. And what does that mean? That means that we need to start thinking about how we're presenting the message to the public, how we start educating them about what are the capabilities of these technologies. That way we don't inflict a trust in automation that might be above what the capability of the vehicle is, or we don't kill that dream of mobility by saying this technology is bad, it's gonna kill you, it's awful, when the reality might not be it. I try to talk about the end user because we have multiple different types of end user. We have the public, the consumers. We also have the end user of standards, regulations that I have to applaud the work that SAE is doing with standard development, as well as National Safety Council with My Car Does What to start educating the public. But we have to truly do this, meaning we are a little bit of what I call safety hypocrites by waving the flag about I memorize only the standard name or number and say, I know all about 3016 and I use 3016. But do we actually know what is behind it? Do we know the terminology? Can we actually start talking and communicating to each other about what the capabilities of these vehicles are? And why do I stress that? Because if we cannot do it with the right terminology, we're not going to be able to explain it to the customers. We're not going to be able to explain it to the end user, to people that have limitations, either cognitive limitation, either visual limitations that are going to be using that technology. We are not talking about limiting us that have the privilege of driving. We are talking about providing that privilege to others that cannot drive right now.
Great, thank you. Okay, Christoph, you at Navia? Navia, you have made some amazing technical progress. We talked about that. So can you give us just an idea, description? You're deployed globally. So let's go for it.
So at Navia, we have founded this company 4 years ago in order to perhaps to think about inventing new system of mobility. And of course, to take advantage of what the autonomous vehicle should bring to the market. And very rapidly, we decided to create a new vehicle. So perhaps you will have the opportunity to test it because just outside of the stadium, you can use it. And it was the creation of the autonomous shuttles that we are the first vehicles that we have created, only 25 kilometers per hour, 15 different people inside the vehicle. And at the same time, we were thinking about the future. And so last year, we created a second vehicle, which is an autonomous cab, a robot taxi that should take place also in the streets of the cities. And the main target of Navia was really to say, we will succeed in making that vehicle autonomous. So it was really interesting that to think that we have been able to transport more than 300,000 different people for more than 3 years now, and everything is going well for the moment, so it's crazy. And it's really interesting to see the reaction of the people which are being transported, because of course the safety of the people, the passenger, is the main target that we have. Of course, we have now solved a lot of different issues during the history last year. We have some issues which needs to be fixed, to have discussion with different people here, and to say how can we manage to take the right decision to make that. If we are in a position perhaps to exchange with every people, I think that we'll have a large number of solutions to bring to the market. And in order to demonstrate that already today we can reduce the number of accidents, because we have two main targets for the autonomous vehicle. Of course, to bring new system of mobility, because more and more people are living in big cities. So you need to reduce congestion, reduce pollution, and so it's really our first mission. Second mission, of course, as you may know, 90% of all the accidents are due to human beings. And so if we want to make a vehicle safer, we need to have an autonomous vehicle in the future. Because, of course, we are making systems, thanks to the sensors, to the software that we are developing, that have a reaction time which is much more rapid than a human being. And so this is really an interesting. And what we have done in Navia is to create this vehicle, and we can one more time see them outside, without steering system and pedal. So the first target of Navia was really to be what we call, or used to be called level 5 vehicles. That's to say, we have nobody on board which is able to take over the control of the vehicle. So this is why we are working very hard today.
Okay, all right, very good. So I want to unpack some ideas. So these these words are thrown out: public perception, collaboration, and rulemaking, and so on. But what do these actually mean? And so I'm going to start with the question of public perception. When we are worried about the public accepting these cars, why don't we just believe that as they are deployed on the road gradually over the next decade and a half, that people will just become naturally accustomed to this? So that question, and the second question right along with it is what is it that people are imagining when we're worried about these perceptions? What is it that is in the public mind that is so scary about the cars? Faye.
Well, I think there's a few things, right, that's scary. So we're in the IoT age, as I like to call it, the Internet of Threats. So what my organization really does focus on is cybersecurity. And we all know that the more and more interconnected we become, the higher the cyber risk. And with that risk, of course, comes all these great efficiencies, but a fear. And the public are concerned about that. Now, if you take a look at how vehicles have been used by like the worst case threat actors, they've been used to do bombings in different cities and so forth. What would happen if they have autonomous vehicles and are able to get into the network with a system of systems and somehow take over the vehicle? So those are some of the fears. The other fear is we've already seen, we've experienced. Chairman Hart mentioned the Uber accident. There's been Tesla, et cetera. There's already been some challenges that we've seen by trying to understand how to do this and deploy it. So I think there's a great deal of concern, and if we go back to my good friend Alex over here, from a safety perspective, none of us want to see any accidents. We want to go to zero. And we have to do that very systematically and very carefully. And I think those are some of the fears.
Alex.
If I can just add on to that a little bit. The chairman mentioned that automakers voluntarily got together and said that AEB is going to be deployed on vehicles in 2022. 99% of the vehicles that are produced are going to have AEB. One of the interesting things is that what was not defined are what are the parameters of AEB. And in fact, what do you call AEB? There are over 40 names currently for AEB. So if you go to a automaker, you go to a dealer and say, I want AEB, they might not know exactly what you're looking for. If you say, I want prefrontal crash, or I want eyesight, and you take that to a dealer that is not using that trademark, or even we've talked about this, even the generic names are not standard. Secondly, what they do is not standard. My AEB might see pedestrians. My wife's AEB might not. I get in her car and I'm expecting the vehicle to behave a certain way and it doesn't. So we're talking about threats. You know, the threat is more commonplace than potentially bad actors. It may just be misinformation or not enough information. One other thing is that we at the Safety Council really believe that education is going to be continuous. We talked earlier about an earlier generation that learned to pump the brakes instead of rely on ABS or ESC to pump them for you. Well, nobody sent me an email and said, hey, Al, you got to learn now that you don't pump the brakes anymore. Or when I got my car and there was a backup camera in it, nobody said, you know, the real way you use the backup camera is these are called assistive technologies for a reason. Don't stare into the monitor. Walk around the vehicle. Look in there. Look at the mirrors. This is one tool to help you. It's not the end-all, be-all. So in other words, these are being deployed, but there's no instruction booklet that accompanies them yet. And so...
All right, so the training, 1 second, and then let's go. So the question here on becoming accustomed to the vehicles is being overwhelmed by the technology rather than a fear of cars running haywire or mistrust of just being hands-free in a car. Myra.
I think it's a little bit more than that. First, we need to understand the human. And we're not all created equal, believe it or not. There's technology natives and there's technology immigrants. The newer generations, they're definitely technology natives, and some of us have immigrated from a few years back. So we need to understand what are the concerns of a given generation, to be able to understand what potentially their fears might be, because the fears of a given generation might be what the other generation really wants. So we need to ensure that we understand that. Another aspect, obviously I completely agree, safety above all, that's what I do for a living. But we need to get there. We need to get there somehow. And that's research, and that's safe testing on the roads. And I remember when I was doing the research for my father-in-law, he was one of the first FDA trials for a stent in the carotid artery on the brain, and it looked bad. It looked awful. I started reading, and I was like, we should not do this. And he said, I need to do it. I need to do it for me. And if it doesn't work for me, for the next patient that they're going to try to do this. And still today, he's alive. And that was like 20 years ago. So what are we trying to do? Let's not stop something that could be really amazing because of fear.
Cito?
So concerns of law enforcement would be, for instance, disengaging a autonomous vehicle if it's been involved in a collision. The training, getting to first responders and law enforcement is something I believe that's coming its way through an interaction plan. Some other concerns would be its responses to lights and siren. I think someone spoke on that earlier, how it would recognize an emergency vehicle responding. Or how about an officer directing manual traffic control? How would that technology respond to that officer? So those are just some of the concerns from a law enforcement perspective, because we're concerned about obviously the safety of the public, but of course of our own. We just recently lost 2 officers here in the Bay Area within the last 10 months. And for those of you not from California, it's impacted our department in a big way. One was a result what we believe was distracted driving, the other was impaired driving. If you think about what technology can do in reducing those collisions, I mean, these are just 2 of the 40,000 plus, right? But that's how much it means to the Highway Patrol.
Okay, Christoph, you're hands-on. What kind of perception problems have you confronted?
Jen, the main experiments that we have is with shuttle. So the speed limit for the moment is limited, 25 kilometers per hour. But generally speaking, as soon as the people are entering the vehicle, we are explaining why they are using an autonomous vehicle. And after that, after 2 minutes or 3 minutes, say, okay, it works. Because a lot of people which are now used to the technologies, are used to your mobile phone, they can call somebody at the other end of the world and so on. So one little story, when the first time the vehicle was running, I took my daughter and said, okay, look that, it's extraordinary. And she makes a little run with the vehicle and say, yes, and so what? Because, it's natural for them. So what we definitely need to do is to, at the same time, to make the people feel in safe way. At the same time, we need to demonstrate that these vehicles are safe. So we need to cooperate with everybody and say, okay, what the kind of situation that we have been facing, because I think that somebody was talking about simulation, testing, and so on. It's great, a lot of things, but the real life on the road is completely crazy. We have made some experiments, for example, in France. In France, the people are not following the regulation, and so a lot of things very different are happening. And it's really interesting to see how we can solve this kind of situation. And so on. So I'm not telling that we are at the end of the road, but frankly speaking, we think that we can make something very interesting right now with this kind of vehicle. And we are now not so far from having a vehicle within big cities. And because I think that one of our main competitors are on the way to make it happen, I think, in the US in a very short term. And at the same time, of course, we need to have a core of all the technology which is available. Some people were there a few minutes ago saying, it's not a question whether or not we might use the LiDAR, the radars, or the camera. Every technology, every kind of sensors has to be on board the vehicle. Because in each occasion, in each case, sometimes the LiDAR are much more efficient. The other one are the radars and the cameras. We need to put all this technology on board the vehicle. There is no choice. And if we are making that, and if there is a cooperation between the different actors, of course we can make the vehicle more safe and at a very high speed. High speed also. Development, not high speed.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Okay, all right. This is good. I want to shift over then to guideline making or rule making, the whole idea of being collaborative and coming up to what does safe deployment look like? We have an example that was just made. The Department of Transportation, Federal Department of Transportation has just released a 70-page report, guidelines how self-driving trucks should be made and deployed. So I want to ask, what do we think about that? One of the main takeaways is that the government should not be in the business of making these guidelines. Industry should take the front seat. So what do we think of these guidelines, and what do we think of this idea the government should just get out of the way? Faye.
Well, so the government does a necessary activity called regulation, and that is needed for safety. And I'm not going to poke at that other than to say it's needed. The question becomes, what is that type of regulation? That becomes the harder question, particularly in autonomous vehicles. Until we really understand more, it's difficult for them to regulate. And in this IoT environment, with an emergent threat called cyber, it's very difficult to do that. So what we recommend in the Auto ISAC is that best practices be really embraced and endorsed. And one of the things that we do as the Auto ISAC, besides threat intelligence sharing, is that we actually collaborate on building best practices across our membership. Really critical to start to learn about what each other are doing. It gets to Chairman Hart's comments about not only do you focus, of course, on safety and security and resiliency, you also start to learn and actually increase and lift the overall boat, or in this case vehicle, ecosystem much faster. So we have embarked on building best practices. We are right now on one of the hardest best practice guides called Security by Design. That is guide number 7, and as we develop them, we let our members absorb them, and then we actually share that out with a greater industry as well. So we embrace best practices. Now, ultimately, there will be regulation. I think there has to be. We hope that the government will obviously moderate that based on the current state of affairs, which is challenging.
Do you have any kind of takeaway that we can learn from about the 70-page report, just the first stab at regulation?
Well, we certainly, part of our membership includes trucking, so PACCAR was on the stage earlier, and they are a member. Clearly, they are diving into those, and there are some concerns about what's been published. But, I don't have anything more specific than that.
Thank you. Alex?
We know that if there is voluntary cooperation and agreement among those concerned, that it cuts the time for enactment significantly. So this AEB agreement apparently shaved about 3 or 4 years off of the idea of coming together under some regulated federal mandate. The industry is moving very quickly. And I'm guessing that Velodyne, just to pick on our hosts for a minute, is not going to rest on the laurels of last year's model for very long. And so how does the technology that they have accumulated and are trying to bring to market get regulated by a government authority that may be playing catch-up? I'm not saying there isn't great capability amongst our public servants. I'm just saying that, look at how many times your phone updates, every day. And so how does the federal government, which is charged with vehicle design and vehicle safety, it's one of the mandates of the Department of Transportation, how do they keep up to date with all of what's happening? So from our perspective, we want to see voluntary agreements. Today, for instance, at this time, there's a webinar being held out of DC, which is going to talk about some commonality around nomenclature for ADAS systems. And this came about because of discussions of all stakeholders, including the federal government, but not limited to. SAE was part of it, we were part of it, AAA was part of it, Consumers Union, consumers, a variety of stakeholders got together and said, what can we call these things? And how do we make sense? Is it a warning or is it an alert? And so we really believe that in such a fast-moving technology, the regulation will come, it has to come, but I think that it may be a mistake for the government, for the government to make pronouncements when by the time the ink is dry, it's no longer relevant.
So just to wrap up that thought, get out of the way for now. Is that sort of?
I think for me, from our perspective, and the idea is to allow innovation to continue, but in a safe way. So how does that happen? The states still maintain the ability to control what gets deployed within their state at this point. And there's still methods of enforcement once the vehicle gets deployed, even if there aren't specific regulations, if we're finding out that there are unsafe vehicles on the road. So I'm not advocating no regulation. I'm saying that it's difficult to regulate when the industry is moving that fast. I would like, at some point, we'd like to see, I think I don't want to speak for the auto industry, right? I'm not an auto industry person, but I really believe that it's helpful when a manufacturer can say, we are building against this standard. I think it's helpful at some level.
Okay. Myra, I want you to answer, but I want to throw in something more too. Can we have, when we're talking about regulation, I mean, I hear this all the time, regulation, okay, but I hear no examples of what has to be regulated. So what is the thing? Go ahead, whatever you were going to say, but also say, give us an example or two. What does that mean?
Will do. There are several things that we're talking about this technology, and I use the analogy of the body versus the brain. Currently, the safety standards that we have are evaluating for example, the manufacturers will self-certify to those standards, and NHTSA will verify compliance to those standards, either if it's brakes or electronic stability control, the windows. We have that platform. It has things that need to be refined, if you will. That way, automated driving systems, dedicated vehicles in driverless mode, which means they do not have a steering wheel or pedal, can actually perform those test procedures. I'm currently working on that for NHTSA. Another aspect that does not exist right now is that same type of federal motor vehicle safety standards for the brain. That is basically now our new driver, the one that is going to be deciding what the behavior and the performance of that vehicle is. That currently is under the purview for the human driver of the Department of Motor Vehicles, doing the licensing and so on. What is going to happen to that future driver is something that we need to decide. And I agree, similar to the testing that we do for safety, it's not regulation for regulation's sake. For safety's sake, it probably needs to be standardized. That way everybody knows how to comply with the minimal safety standard. One thing to allude, you mentioned, and I'm in the middle of the two because I'm currently working on those safety standards. And the idea is, it's not research, it's not government, it's not industry, it's all working together. And that's what I'm currently trying to do. I have over 30 stakeholders that are trying to help us and help NHTSA understand what are the potential barriers.
Just one follow-up there. What about the cyber side? Cyber has been raised 2 or 3 times today. Who takes the lead on protecting the cars from cyber intrusion, cyber takeover, whatever the cyber dangers are?
To me?
Myra, yeah,
there's currently not FMVSS for cybersecurity. There's guidance, and actually the Auto ISAC is doing a great job doing that. And NHTSA has also provided some guidance similar to what they have done for AV 3.0 that you alluded to.
Faye, did you want to say something?
There is no regulation on cyber. We had the same issue in aviation initially as well. And so, you know, there was security, but not cyber security. And so the regulator wasn't ready at FAA to do that. Now they have embarked on that. They pulled together industry to support how do they regulate. I don't think NHTSA is that far along yet. They've done the best practices, as Myra has mentioned. They did that in October of 2016, so that's 2 years ago. We started our best practice development at around the same time. Having met with NHTSA last week, I said, where are you with the development and the update to the best practices? They said, we're not ready to do another update at this time. So I think they're still trying to learn what this all means as well, just like we all are. We're all learning in this space.
Can I just make one more comment before we move on? Data sharing. Okay, it's been talked about earlier. At this point, there is no common language for talking about how sensors fail, how the sensor fusers fail, if they fail. We need a common terminology and a common way to collect data from all manufacturers, I believe, because the sharing of data gives information for potential regulators and for the industry itself to decide on best practices. What is secondly, the AV guidelines, which the federal government has released, the guidelines call for voluntary safety assessments. Every manufacturer that is doing testing is asked to submit voluntarily for the public their assessment. How many companies are testing in California currently?
Well, there's, I think, about 40 to 50, but there's 500 plus vehicles out there now.
So 50-ish companies. Anybody have an estimate on how many safety assessments have been submitted? 3 or 4 currently. So the point is that it's, at some point we would like to see that guidance become more of a regulation, because we'd like people to disclose how they view safety.
Let me ask, Cito, where is law enforcement in this interregnum where they're not solid, they're barely guidelines, rules? How do where do you come down on voluntary or laws regulation?
Where does law enforcement come down on voluntary?
Can you speak for all of law enforcement?
I was going to say something. I work for the state, so the state's about 50 years behind, so we're way behind. That's a difficult question. I really am not sure. The laws have to be changed. The rules of the road have to be changed. There's a specific chapter in the California Vehicle Code that really is going to be impacted by this. The way we draft our collision reports as an agency is going to be changed as a result of this technology. So those are still in the process. They're legislative, and the department's just working with that as right now.
Christophe?
What is really interesting also is to have a global view, because we have the opportunity in Navia to operate in more than 18 countries. So we think a very global view of what is the attitude of the regulators and so on. So as so many people are waiting for each other, of course the best practices should be, I think, part of the solution. And I think that everybody has to perhaps to follow all these different guidance that we can give everybody together. And I think it will bring much more confidence in such vehicle in the future. So we definitely need to talk together and to promote, of course, the sharing of data, of knowledge, and so on. Of course, at the same time, what is a little bit complicated is everybody is talking about a market that should account in billions and billions of dollars in the future. So a lot of people think that what they have done is really a part of their knowledge and their know-how, and they're not so easy. It's not so easy to share what everybody is making. So at the same time, we need to find an equilibrium between all that, and it's not so easy to make that happen. But we are working hard for that, and we'll publish a safety assessment in the very coming weeks.
We have run out of time. Thank you very much, and please thank the panel.
Thank you.